battlefields, how the Ukrainians are being forced to throw in apparently reserves that they were preferring to hold back to try to plug the gaps in Zaporozhye, how Ukraine is finding it difficult to sustain an attrition war. And there's been lots of articles, including there was that article by Big Serge, he discussed this as well. Brian Baletic has talked about this extensively, about how Ukraine has been losing machines and vehicles at staggering speeds, how it started with a very large tank fleet, large numbers of armoured vehicles at the start of the war, how all of those were lost by midsummer, how the United States and its allies then managed to replace at least some of those lost weapons, those lost tanks and armoured vehicles with former Soviet weapons drawn from former Warsaw Pact arsenals that now are possessed by countries that have now become parts of NATO. How over the course of the summer, new brigades with this new equipment was built up, but how that's also been largely lost over the course of the fighting in the autumn, the fighting in Kharkiv and in Kherson region. And the United States is now telling Ukraine, look, only do this up to a point. We can't realistically match the Russians in artillery. That is beyond our power to do. We can send you armored weapons, but our very, very strong advice to you is don't do the same thing again that you did in the autumn, which is fritter this new supply of armoured vehicles in further offensives and pull out of Bakhmut and avoid getting drawn into situations where the Russians are able to make effective use of their massive artillery advantage. Now, as I said, how the Ukrainians are able to do that, would be able to do that, how the Ukrainians can use tanks and armoured vehicles that in a way that somehow negates the Russian artillery advantage, I myself cannot see. But anyway, that does appear to be the advice. Well, in the meantime, we have further tensions within Ukraine. We've had an apparent admission from Ukraine, but it's not been very widely circulated, and I'm not sure that it is an admission at all, that Solidar has fallen to the Russians. A BBC journalist, the BBC was reporting that Ukrainian soldiers are admitting that Ukraine has pulled out of Solidar. I've not yet seen anywhere any sign of any official admission of this from any senior Ukrainian government official. Perhaps that admission has not yet been made, despite what the BBC appears to think. But again, we see that Ukraine is perhaps resistant to this advice, because the unwillingness to admit that Solidar has been lost, and by the way, some of those Ukrainian soldiers that the BBC spoke to were still apparently talking about counterattacks to retake Solidar. Well, they've probably been briefed by their Ukrainian superiors to say that, but we see that there doesn't seem to be any desire on the part of Ukraine to heed this advice, to listen to the advice the Americans are giving, both about avoiding attrition war and about avoiding offensives. They seem to be still determined, despite American advice, to try to hold on to Bakhmut. They're still talking about counterattacks in Solidar. They may not, I suspect they're not officially admitting that Solidar has fallen, and the reports suggest that they are again, or at least they may be considering some kind of further offensive in the Svatovo, Kremenaya area, despite the advice of the Americans not to engage in offensives at this particular time. Now, I am not going to discuss today in this program why the Ukrainians remain so insistent upon holding on to every millimetre of territory and in launching counterattacks. I suspect that this has much to do with the internal situation in Ukraine itself now and with the political position of President Zelensky and his government. But anyway, the fact is that the United States appears to have come to many of the views which have been expressed on this program, that there is no point clinging on to Bakhmut. And by the way, this Reuters article looks to me like the first clear-cut admission from a US official who's still hiding behind actions. No doubt this time this briefing really did happen. But this is the first definite confirmation that the US is urging Ukraine to pull its forces out of Bakhmut. And we see that the United States is now telling Ukraine that however important Bakhmut is, it's not worth the cost in lives to defend it. And we also see that the United States is giving advice to Ukraine not to embark on further offensives, to try to engage in some kind of defensive strategy, at least for the next couple of months. And that, I suspect, is the real message that's being communicated in the background. We shouldn't pay too much attention to all this talk about Ukraine winning the war. General Milley has said publicly that this would be very, very difficult to achieve this year, expelling all those Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. And we see that in private, the United States is telling the Ukrainians the same thing. This is a bad idea, that they're getting drawn into, dragged into attrition warfare. The United States cannot counter that attrition. And in fact, this is working against Ukraine in the long term. Now, to get a sense of the kind of problem all this is causing, consider this article that's just appeared on the Responsible Statecraft website, and it's by Anatol Levin, who is discussing, he's setting out his opinions about the war. And he says that the Germans, this is the title of the article, remain adamantly opposed to sending any Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Well, I'm not sure how adamantly opposed they actually are. But then he goes on to say, and this is a point that is indisputably true, that the United States and its allies have never clearly worked out what the purpose of the war now is, what they intend, what their ultimate goals in this war in particular are. And to quote the article, and the problem presented by for NATO as an alliance and for the US, German and French governments in particular is that they do not actually know what they want in Ukraine. They have pledged to help Ukraine win, but have not decided what victory means. The Ukrainian, Polish and Baltic governments know they want the complete defeat of Russia, the reconquest of all the territory lost by Ukraine since 2014, and preferably the overthrow of the Putin regime and the breakup of the Russian state. For cooler heads in Berlin, Paris and Washington, this is a likely path to a NATO-Russia war and the possibility of mutual nuclear annihilation. Note that Levin talks about cooler heads, which essentially concedes the fact that there are also hotter heads, in other words, people in Washington at least, who are fully in favor of this agenda of reconquest of all Ukrainian territory lost since 2014, the overthrow of Putin's government and the breakup of Russia. But anyway, let's move on, because this is part of the article that I found really interesting. Thus, the Biden administration is now being quoted as saying that it wishes Ukraine to be able to credibly threaten to take Crimea. At the same time, administration officials insist that this threat is designed to bring Russia to the negotiating table and make them willing to compromise rather than to actually encourage Ukraine.
Holt's here. We need lots of backup.